The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we have reached the end of the year. This is our second to last show. We're starting to do that thing where we look back on the year that was. That will be, in fact, our last show coming up. And we're going to do a couple special things for our folks on Patreon. So if you haven't signed up for our Patreon community to get the weekly digest, also some of our updates, and we're doing Zoom calls, plus we're going to do some videos this week for everybody on the Patreon community. Go to patreon.com/China Africa Project. And a big thank you to everybody on Patreon who is supporting us. Cobus, if we look back on 2021 and we talk about what are the most important China-Africa stories, there is one that stands out far and above everything else, and that is the China DR Congo story. It really kicked up back in May when Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi went to Sicomines and went into the mining belt and really laid down a line in the sand that basically said, the rules that we've been using for up to this point are going to change. And in fact, we are going to hold you to account for more of the infrastructure. We're going to push you on the contracts because the contracts that you signed, so said Félix Tshisekedi, under the Kabila administration, that's the prior president, are not going to stand. And this led to a whole summer of controversy and tension and back and forths and propaganda. Then what we started to see in the fall is things started to calm down. But nonetheless, what has happened these past 6-7 months has been remarkable. And it's emerged that the DR Congo today is by far the most consequential relationship that China has in Africa. And I think that will come as a surprise to a lot of people who've been following the story for a long time. But the reason why, in part, is because of the cobalt and the copper, but mostly the cobalt that's coming out of the southeastern DRC. So, Cobus, we've seen a lot of unprecedented behavior from the Chinese and how they engage Africa in the DRC. We've also seen it as a venue for great power competition. And again, I just what I've seen over the past year in this story has been nothing short of remarkable.
It's also very interesting that the China-DRC relationship has also become a space for civil society to kind of express their unhappiness with the Chinese, including there's been several kind of like big controversies around labor violence, around environmental degradation, all of these different issues, but they all kind of fit into this bigger issue of the mining contracts and the profits, because of course, these are incredibly valuable commodities. The DRC is an incredibly poor country. Where is the money going? So I think that there's a lot of questions around that issue and a lot of answers.
Just before we go on much further in this show, I just want to make something very, very clear. There are really two sets of stories, and people have been often mixing and conflating them. So there's been, in recent weeks, if you've noticed, the Chinese embassy in Kinshasa issued a warning for all of its nationals to evacuate 3 provinces in the eastern Congo, that is North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri province. They had a deadline of December 10th to get out, and if they didn't leave by December 10th, they were going to be on their own. Those Chinese miners that are out in those eastern provinces are small-scale independent miners. They are very different than the huge multinational mining companies, and this is at the center of these contract disputes with the president and the government in Kinshasa. So those are two very different stories. Just want to make sure we are clear on that, because I think a lot of people have cross signals on that. So when we started to get towards the end of the year, things started to calm down a little bit. Then towards the end of November, a huge story dropped. 19 media outlets, 5 NGOs in the US and Europe poured through 3.5 million documents that were leaked from a Gabonese bank called Groupe BGFI Bank. And that detailed how tens of millions of dollars flowed to the former Congolese president, Joseph Kabila, his family, and his associates. Now, a couple of the details that came out of this investigation that was dubbed Congo Hold-Up, at least $138 million passed through BJFI Bank, two companies owned by President Kabila's inner circle. An additional $105 million from various sources was also credited on those accounts belonging to the same group. And there's also a strong Chinese connection because according to the investigation's findings, millions of dollars went from various Chinese entities, again, through this bank to the Kabila network. And there is evidence that shows Chinese owners of the copper and cobalt mines did use that same bank to funnel millions as well. So lots of Chinese involvement, but very clear here, it's not only about the Chinese. Now, how all of this came together, the information was obtained by a Paris-based anti-corruption group called Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa, and also by the French news site Mediapart. It was then shared with media organizations via the European Investigative Collaborations Network, along with 5 NGOs. Bloomberg News was also part of that effort, and journalists there spent 6 months going through all of the documents. They also spoke with dozens of sources across 5 continents around the world, both to confirm what they found in those leaked documents and also then to complement the investigation with some new information. 2 of the journalists who worked on that investigative effort are with us today, and we're thrilled to have them. William Clowes is Bloomberg's reporter in Nigeria, but he formerly worked in the DR Congo. A very good afternoon to you, William.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful to have you on the show. And we're also thrilled to have on the show Michael Kavanagh, who is a Bloomberg correspondent in Kinshasa in the DR Congo. And a very good morning to you, Michael.
Thanks, Eric. Great to talk.
It's fantastic to have both of you on. This has been a huge story. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Let's kind of start at the beginning. How did you guys get involved in this investigation, and give us the origins of how it all began? And then we're going to get into what you found a little bit later. But just talk to us about how this all started for you guys.
Sure. I'll start with this one. William and I have both been working on Congo for many, many years. Around a decade, in William's case, maybe even more, and then for me since 2004. So we've had a bunch of experience in Congo, and we were presented about a year and a half ago with the opportunity to look at some leaked files. As you can imagine, or as you've probably seen from some of the other collaborations or journalistic consortia, Panama Papers and Paradise Papers and things like that, it involves a lot of different media organizations doing a very complicated dance to figure out how to work together. It's not something that Bloomberg has previously done in the past. So, this was something that William and I worked on really closely with our editors, with the top brass at Bloomberg, and then with all these different media organizations over the past more than 6 months to kind of claw through these documents, which were uploaded to a discrete server that we had access to and could search. And we spent months and months just looking through file after file with the team, with the collaboration between the different media outlets and NGOs, and where we all shared our findings, and then were able to kind of piece together a bunch of stories. And one of the stories, and the story that William and I thought was the most interesting because it's so underreported, is the relationship between the Kabila family and the various Chinese companies, state-owned, some private, that have really taken over the mining sector in southeastern Congo. As you said, the mining sector is mainly there, copper and cobalt.
William, can you give us an idea of roughly kind of what proportion of the scandal also involves the Chinese actors? Of course, when we covered it, we were focusing on the Chinese angle. And then as I was reading all of these different stories, I realized I actually have no idea how serious the Chinese part of the story is compared to the breadth of the rest of it, because it's so huge. So, so how do those two kind of fit into each other?
So I think the Chinese aspect of this leak is relatively small, but a small part of 3.5 million documents is still quite large. Obviously, the rest of our consortium members have published dozens of stories now on more than $100 million being transiting BGFI of state funds to companies either owned by the Kabila family or the Kabila family's associates. We've had stories released by the consortium on the activities of individuals sanctioned by the US for financing Hezbollah. There's been stories about the Pharaoh Islands, about France, about Belgium, about Switzerland. This is sort of, as the international finance works, it's taken in all sorts of corners of the world. The Chinese aspect of it centered really around one middleman and his company, a guy who I'm sure we'll talk about more as the podcast goes on, a guy called Du Wei and his company, Congo Construction Company. So a relatively small slice of the leak was about the Chinese aspect of it, but a very sort of rich source of information, sort of an unprecedented glimpse into things that people may have suspected before, but there was not much proof.
Michael, let's get into who Du Wei is. Let's talk about him and what role he played in this whole affair.
Du Wei is a fascinating character. And I should say that a lot of this work was actually done by the Sentry, which is an anti-corruption group out of Washington that worked closely with the consortium and put out a nearly 100-page report on Du Wei and Congo Construction Company and a lot of these other deals. And Du is an academic. He studied international law at Wuhan University. I think that's right. He got involved in Congo many years ago, more than a decade ago, and was involved in the Sicomine project that you talked about, which is the mining project that's linked to the $6.2 billion minerals for infrastructure deal between China and Congo. And Du Wei worked for Sicomine for several years. And then he suddenly switched over to the Congolese side. And that became very interesting because the person that he worked with, Moise Kanga, who is a Congolese businessman, Moise also works for the Kabila family for a company called Strategic Projects and Investments. He's the COO of that company. So what we saw in the documents was this link between Du Wei and between Moise Kanga, and they seemed to be working in concert to transfer money from a variety of Chinese companies, but most importantly, the Sicomine mine itself, right? Because that's an important collaboration between China and Congo. State-owned companies from both countries are involved in the project. And Du and Moise Kanga seemed to transfer a lot of money from that project and from projects linked to Sicomine in various ways to companies that were linked to the Kabila family, often owned by Kabila family members. And Du was central in making that happen.
Yeah, can you be a little more specific about what exactly he did? Why would Sino-Hydro or these big Chinese state-owned enterprises need somebody like Du to be a middleman in this process between Sicomines and the government? What was their precise role that they played, these two fixers that you talked about?
Will should answer that. He did a lot of the good work on this.
Yeah. So their motives, I do not know, but essentially you had these rampant conflict of interests everywhere. You had Du Wei going from as an employee of Sicomines, then moving in 2012, I think, to the government agency run by a Kanga that was responsible for overseeing the spending of the money under the Sino-Congolese relationship. And you had a Kanga both as the government official in charge of this agency, but also as a representative CEO of Kabila's private company. But the role that Du seems to play in 2012, late 2012, he sets up this company, Congo Construction Company, CCC. And its main role seems to be, from our analysis of the banking records, it seems to be funneling money that comes from a Chinese origin to companies, entities, individuals associated with Joseph Kabila, by which we mean his family and his close political allies. So in the case of Sicomines, what we were talking about just now, there are in the summer of 2016, in 3 separate payments, Sicomines sends $25 million to to Du's company, CCC, at this bank from BGFI, from which the leaked documents came. And the majority of those funds we can trace were distributed by Du's company to these Kabila-affiliated destinations.
And do you have any idea of what exactly these sums were paying for? I mean, is it possible to trace that, or is it simply a kind of to kind of cement a general support from the Kabila side, or is there any kind of kind of idea of this payment triggering a particular something come in the future?
One thing it could be is that one of the things that was holding back the Sicomines project and took many, many years to sort out was the lack of a reliable power supply. So in 2016, around the time, between the first and third payment, in fact, so exactly the same time the payments were being made, the government, the Chinese parties, China Railway and Power China, finally make a deal with the government, Congolese government, to resolve this problem and to build a large power plant that will primarily feed the Sicomines mine. This was happening. The sort of end game of these rather tortuous, lengthy negotiations about this power plant were going on at this time that CCC was distributing the money. And there's some sort of rather nice details that the Century found, which was at this time that Du was distributing this money. He was also publishing a pair of academic papers where he spoke about this power supply dilemma, as he called it, and how it threatened the ability of Sicomines to reach its full capacity. And in another article, he decried the sort of unsophisticated and crude tactics that many Chinese companies resorted to in developing countries to win contracts. All the time he was, handing out this money from Sicomines to people associated with the then president of Congo.
Is Du still in the DRC, or is he back in China, or you don't know where he is?
We, during the course of our investigation, obviously we gave everybody plenty of time, everyone we mentioned in the reporting, plenty of time to reply and to offer their comments before we published. Most people chose not to reply to us in this instance, but a couple of people who replied to us told us that Du was no longer in the DRC.
And we should mention too that Du seems to have deleted one of his WhatsApp accounts and one of his email accounts when Will was in touch with him to get a right of reply.
Michael, what kind of reaction has all of these revelations drawn from the DRC government? Do you have any kind of idea about all of this kind of continuous issues around the contracts and the renegotiations of the contracts and so on? To which extent there was a direct connection between that and kind of these revelations, and in more in general, what do you make of the kind of official reaction in the DRC up to now?
The reaction by the Congolese government at the moment has been interesting, and it's hard to really sum up. It's been a little bit all over the place. A lot of it has been very positive. A lot of the investigations that the Congo Hold-Up consortium has done, it lines up perfectly with some of the investigations that Congo's government has been doing, that the Inspector General of Finance has been doing for the past year or so now in Congo. And so in a lot of ways, our information complements theirs as their information complements ours. What we're showing now, and what I think that the Congolese government really hasn't had in the past when it's looked into or begun to look into some of these contracts, is actual receipts of payments that seem to be facilitation payments. We can't always say for sure, obviously, but they seem to be facilitation payments between Chinese state-owned companies and a middleman, Duwei, his company, that apparently ends up in the Kabila family's pockets. And so that's something that I think even, as much as you've talked about on the show before, the kind of move that Felix Tshisekedi, the current president of Congo, is making to consolidate his power and split ties with the former president, Joseph Kabila, who ruled Congo for 18 years, as much as he's been making changes and bringing in his people, he's never really gone after Kabila in particular. And I think what we're showing are very close ties between the Kabila family and a lot of these companies that are going to be difficult for the government to ignore. That said, you can also see that, the government's been a little bit defensive, as have the Chinese, for that matter, of course, the embassy and some of these companies. But the whole, Congo Hold-Up, it's not just about the Kabila family. As Will said, it's not just about Chinese. It's about a lot of business people from around the world, the enablers, the lawyers, the various auditing companies that are working with these banks. And it's also about some of the people in the current administration too. So it's a leak. It's an investigation that takes into account kind of years of kleptocratic behavior that has become cultural in Congo's government. And so it calls into question the system, and I think it's going to take a lot of work to move beyond this kind of behavior. But I would say that's the kind of thing that we're seeing with the investigations that you've talked about on the show, prompted by the Inspector General of Finance, or just, the oversight that's happening in Congo that hasn't happened in years with the new IMF program. The IMF has signed a $1.5 billion 3-year program with Congo that includes a lot of oversight for governance and for the central bank and for Sicomines and for these mining companies. It's calling for audits into a lot of these mining companies and deals. And so I think for the first time, we're seeing a way that a new administration is holding a past administration to account in Congo. That's really exciting for us to see for the first time in 18 years.
It's also worth mentioning that even before we in the consortium revealed these sort of fishy payments through of Chinese money through CCC to people around the president. Even without that, there are all sorts of reasons why a new president might be inclined to take a much closer look at Sicomines and the overall $6 billion minerals for infrastructure project, even without the sort of revelations that have come out over recent weeks.
So on November 29th, Sicomines issued a press release where it said it was both amazed and indignant about the findings of the Congo Hold-Up investigation. They denounced it and brushed it aside. Then there was a press conference just a couple of weeks ago featuring John Omumbo, who's the spokesman for the semi-official Sino-Congolese Program Coordination and Monitoring Office. He said, and I'm quoting here, this supposed investigation carried out by 5 NGOs and 19 Western media outlets, and emphasized the word Western, and that's important, that is determined to sully the reputation of DRC institutions and to discourage investors, especially Chinese entrepreneurs. So he gave this fiery press conference where he didn't take any questions. It was at the Fleuve Hotel, very fancy 5-star hotel in Kinshasa, and he really said that this was a Western plot to discredit the Congo, sounding very much like the traditional Chinese talking points on how anytime something negative comes up, it's a Western agenda to drive a wedge between China and the Congo, or China and Africa. So very much the John Omumbo, a spokesman there, sounding that way. Michael, you guys, both of you actually, have been covering Sicomines, and Sicomines is central to this. And I think a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with Sicomines. It was called back in the day the deal of the century. It was really the first mega China-Africa deal. It started out at $9 billion, then came down to $6 billion, but it's been a really important bookmark in the broader China story in Africa. Michael, can you kind of take us back to 2008, 2007, to the origins of the deal so we can better understand Sicomines and its role with Jacquemines and why it's so important in this story today?
Sure. So, Congo was at war for years. From the mid-90s, the war officially ended in 2003. It involved almost all of Congo's neighbors. It was bloody. The IRC famously said that, more than 5 million people were killed in the fighting. And when Joseph Kabila came into power, so his father was assassinated, Laurent Désiré Kabila, in 2001. And then Joseph Kabila, who was only 29 at the time, he took over power. And then he signed a peace agreement with many of the nations involved. And then he was elected president in 2006. When this happened, he was looking for financing. The problem was, of course, no one really people wanted to invest in Congo, but they were very nervous about it. It was very risky. And, as we all know, World Bank and IMF money comes with a lot of strings attached. And so the Chinese came in, and they'd already had some of their companies working in some of the mining projects in Congo. And the Chinese government then came in and said, we have a deal for you. We're going to give you money from China Exim Bank, and they're going to fund a bunch of infrastructure projects, and then they're also going to fund a $3.2 billion copper cobalt mine, and all of the money, the profits from the copper cobalt mine will go to pay back this, as you said, $9 billion deal. Now, the IMF looked at that, Western governments looked at that and said that was unsustainable, that debt. So they got them to reduce it to $6.2 billion. And then they started to go forward. And, pretty quickly you saw in investments in roads, in hospitals, in a bunch of other projects, bridges, things like that were Congo desperately needed. And the plan was to build about $3 billion worth of infrastructure projects. But the problem from the beginning, as I think we've seen across Africa, is there was a huge lack of transparency into this deal. People didn't have access to the contracts, the infrastructure projects. There was no audit of them. There certainly was no external independent audit. We didn't even know which infrastructure projects were part of the infrastructure deal. It's one of the things we did as reporters for years, was just try to figure out which Chinese projects actually belonged to the deal and which didn't. And it was overseen on the Congolese side, by this bureau that you talked about, the China Bureau, who was also equally untransparent. And I remember there was a press conference in 2013 in Kinshasa where we were able to ask, well, how much has been spent on infrastructure? And at the time, the Bureau, Moise Kanga, the man we talked about earlier, who runs the Bureau, he said that the Chinese companies, through Exim Bank, had paid $1 billion in infrastructure projects. Well, Congo's government, only a few months ago, said that only $825 million in infrastructure projects had been accomplished at this point. So it's been a project that, the Sicomine mine began producing in about 2015. That project seems to be going well. It's an extraordinary mine. I've been there. I've been inside the plant. It's really, world class. It's a world class copper cobalt mine. But on the infrastructure side, we're really seeing the projects lag behind. And less than a third of the promised infrastructure projects have been built. And we're now 13, 14 years into this into this project. And so the new government is finally looking at the project and saying, what has happened here? Why has this stopped? And the questions are, and the reasons are complicated, as you can imagine. But part of the reasons is that on it's just governance issues, governance on the Congolese side, where I think some of the Chinese companies, in particular Exim Bank, was worried about being reimbursed for the projects that they were undertaking. And now NGOs and journalists and the Congolese government itself, for the first time, is really taking a hard look at this project. This is work we've been doing for years in Western mining companies, right? We've been writing about Glencore and other mining companies operating in Congo and really scrutinizing them. And this is the first time really that we've been able to get a good look at this Chinese mining project and the affiliated projects in infrastructure and mining that haven't been, that we haven't been able to look at because of such a lack of transparency.
Yeah, so where do you think accountability lies for the lack of infrastructure and the lack of progress? Is it on the Chinese? I mean, again, it's all opaque, so it's difficult to figure out. But when people blame the Chinese for this, that is the narrative that's dominant out there. But again, as you know from living in the Congo, nothing is as simple as it seems. So where do you think, based on your time there, and William, you can chime in as well because this dates back to when you were there as well, is it on more on the Sicomines side, on the China Exim Bank side, or do you think it's more on the governance side and the fact that there's a capacity problem on the Congolese, in the Congolese government to actually execute these projects?
I think I'll start. There's a tension inherent in the contract, and what's fascinating is Du Wei, in one of his academic papers at the Century Fund, he actually says this. He says the Chinese side wants to start the mine as soon as possible, and the Congolese side wants the infrastructure to be built as soon as possible. And there's a tension inherent there between the two sides.
But why can't both be done at the same time? They're not dependent on each other, are they?
You'd say not entirely, but when it comes to sort of risk on the China Exim Bank side, I think that they're reluctant to send out all the money at first. And I think that the Chinese just wanted the mine built as soon as possible so they could start capturing those funds in return. I think that you're right. I mean, in theory, right, this is, as is always said, a win-win deal, and that should be the point. But there have been governance issues from the beginning, that I just mentioned, and a lack of transparency on both sides about the deal. And I would say, when it comes to who's to blame for the slowness of the project, well, I mean, again, the mine is working very well, but there are governance issues on the Congolese side, and obviously they're linked to in the Chinese companies as well that have slowed down the infrastructure projects. Will probably has more to add about that.
Well, yes, I think Exim Bank's conservatism or nerves at the beginning was probably a factor. Exim Bank actually suspended the financing for a part, and then was for a bit, and then was persuaded to come back in the early 2010s. But yeah, if the Chinese parties were inclined to not give much information away and not to be particularly transparent, they found their perfect partner in Joseph Kabila's presidency, and this bureau we were talking about, run by Moise Kanga, was incredibly untransparent. The Carter Center did a big piece of work on natural resources a couple of years ago, and found it very, very difficult to get anything out of them. And in my experience of reporting there for 4.5 years, it was very, very difficult. They, just before the election at which Joseph Kabila stood down, they thought about giving some interviews, and they sort of did some, and then they didn't like it, so they closed up again. But I think that was the first time since Michael had done one 5 or 6 years before. So it was always very, very difficult to get information out of them, and people would get contradictory figures out of the bureau as well. So it was never entirely clear which set of figures to report, and if they were even accurate.
And one of the things that happened at one point, which was funny, I remember the Congolese government officials used to always say to us, the journalists, one of the great things, one of the features of the China-Congo contract is its lack of specificity. It's good to be vague. That way we can be flexible. And, there's something to be said for that. On the other hand, the vagueness also means that it makes it very difficult to hold anyone to account, because you don't know what the contract actually stipulates and calls for.
Well, in all of these documents of throughout the investigation, how much evidence have you seen of direct involvement by the Chinese embassy in the DRC and other kind of government entities that are like higher up in the Chinese government compared to Chinese companies? And I realize, of course, that the line between those can be quite blurry, particularly on the state-owned enterprise side. But to which extent was do you locate the kind of corruption on the Chinese side in a kind of corporate field, and to which extent did it also spill over into the embassy and the state?
I'd say that's hard for us to really know. There's no doubt that, as you said, this was an important deal for the Chinese government. The Chinese government did step in at one point because there was a hedge fund that was owed, let's say, nearly $100 million in debt after expenses and interest, and they tried to take. There was a signing bonus that the Sicomines had to pay to Jacquemin and to the Congolese government for $350 million. And at one point, this hedge fund tried to seize some of that money to pay off their debt. And the Chinese government stepped in and said, no, this deal is a deal between sovereigns, and you have no right to seize that money because this is a sovereign contract between two nations. So there have been some moments like that when the government itself, it's been very clear, has stepped into the deal. But in general, no, we don't see, besides the typical sort of, cheerleading from the embassy, we don't see a whole lot of evidence, say, of high-level government involvement in the documents that we're seeing. Again, as you said, though, Cobus, that these are state-owned companies for the most part, and so they are an external face of China.
And have you seen any evidence that the United States is involved in this in any way? Because there have been rumors circulating in Washington that U.S. Ambassador Mike Hammer has been pushing Tshisekedi to take action on these contracts. Again, maybe nothing involved with the investigation in Congo Hold-Up, but certainly on the contract review, it's been suggested that the U.S. played a part in this. The word that I heard was that it was not an official policy from the State Department, but it was on Mike Hammer's own initiative to talk to Tshisekedi about this. So there's a difference that it wasn't an order coming from Washington, so not official policy. What has been the role, if any, of the U.S. that you guys are aware of in this whole controversy?
The Sicomines deal is the most important deal in Congo. And so it has, the IMF might call it something like the debt involved with it, macro-critical, which is to say that, to look at the Congolese economy, you need to look at not just Sicomines, but the various Chinese mining deals, all mining deals, but Chinese in particular, because they really do dominate the sector. And therefore, the IMF for years has been saying we need to do an audit of Sicomines. This is not new in any way, and obviously with the U.S. being the biggest shareholder of the IMF, there's something behind it. And if you're looking for money as a new government, the idea that you would turn towards some of these Chinese-owned mines is not a surprising thing. I personally don't see any sort of grand strategy on behalf of the U.S. to try to fight or push back Chinese involvement in the mining sector in Congo in general. That could change. There certainly is a lot of uncomfortableness in the American government about the dominance of the Chinese in Congo. But, there aren't a lot of American companies that want to invest in Congo, especially anymore. And this is, one of the interesting things that we've seen is because of regulations like the bribery law in the UK or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US or in Canada, countries are much more, Western companies are a lot more careful about investing in Congo. And so Chinese companies have filled that void. And I think a lot of companies complain, as do some governments, that the playing field isn't level and they need to do more to change that. So I can imagine that there was a push from maybe even Mike Hammer explicitly to take a look at these contracts. But, they've also done a lot of, the Department of Justice is investigating Glencore. They've sanctioned Dan Gertler, right? This is not just, Dan Gertler is an Israeli billionaire who has huge interests in Congo. In other words, the U.S. is not just going after Congo. They're going after China or Chinese companies. They're going after corruption in the hopes that that will help the Tshisekedi administration find money and do a better job governing the country.
And the irony of all this is that should the DOJ investigation into Glencore have as a consequence them, for some reason, either selling their two mines in Congo or basically being separated from their two key assets in Congo, that it would most likely be Chinese investors, Chinese companies that took them over. And that is something that Glencore's only too aware of and lets people know.
How optimistic are both of you that these revelations and the current kind of attention from the DRC government is actually going to change how business works in the DRC? Are you kind of pessimistic that it's going to continue as corruptly as it has for a long time, or do you see a flicker of hope for actual reform?
I think there is already a little bit of hope. There have been a bunch of brave whistleblowers who, over the past few years, have been leaking documents that have allowed NGOs in Congo, outside of Congo, journalists in Congo and outside. We've been able to see for the first time, not for the first time, but in detail, a lot of the corruption that went on over the past decade or so, if not more. And the government, the change in government, has had a salutary effect too. This Inspector General of Finance really is doing a bunch of investigations into contracts, into deals that, and we've never seen this. I mean, I've never seen this in more than 15 years in Congo. So I have a lot of optimism about that. As you've talked about many times now on the podcast, the Congolese government is now investigating Sicomines and re-looking at the terms of that agreement, and hoping to start to get more money for these infrastructure projects in the coming years. That deal is still in effect. The same thing is true for one of the biggest mines in Congo, a copper cobalt mine run by China Molybdenum Corporation. The Congolese government is looking at the terms of that agreement too. And I have the worry, of course, that everybody says is the Tshisekedi administration just going to replace the Kabila machine with the Tshisekedi machine? And we certainly don't know that yet. But I mean, this is sort of the point of the democratic process. Is there are elections coming up in 2 years, and if he is stealing, and if it comes out, well, he can be removed through an electoral process. So I'm optimistic.
Let me just run a theory. My own personal theory, and it's not as informed as yours, but I'd like to get your take on it, that I believe that Tshisekedi, he needs this controversy to be done. He wants it behind him now. He again, thinking about those elections in 2023, he needs to focus on the campaign, and already he's leaning into the campaign now, starting. And I think come January, that's going to be the kickoff. He needs the Chinese to help fund that campaign. So maybe it's not corruption in the big chunks of money flowing into his relatives, but you guys know Washington politics very well, and there's all sorts of different ways to make sure money gets into the right hands. So it doesn't have to be as crass as it used to be in the Congo. The fact is that Tshisekedi needs the mining companies to help fund his campaign, and the mining companies need Tshisekedi to keep things calm and stable. What do you guys think of that? Am I completely off base, or do you think there's some merit to that?
No, I think that notion of coexistence is a desired coexistence between Chinese miners and Tshisekedi is probably right, because one of the things he's been in power now since January 2019, and one of the criticisms made against him is that he talks a lot, says all the right things, but hasn't actually done very much. To defend him briefly, he spent the best part of, 2 years, sort of in an uneasy coalition with Joseph Kabila and his followers, and then sort of managed to decisively get the upper hand over Kabila and sort of either co-opt or purge all of Kabila's loyalists. So he has some justification in saying, I lost 2 years of my term. But certainly now, with only 2 years left, he really needs to sort of get cracking. And one of the ways that could be done would to have his own relationship with the Chinese miners and sort of restructure some of these deals, whether it's the huge Sicomines minerals for infrastructure project, or the terms of China Molybdenum's contracts at TFM, or the other mine they're building, Kisanfu. I think, in that sense, he would be keen to get this done.
We focus a lot, obviously, on the Chinese angle on this, but as you pointed out, it's this huge investigation that pulls in a lot of other countries. I was looking through some of the coverage, and I was seeing some of your Dutch colleagues and Belgian colleagues, linking to all kinds of issues in the Benelux region, all kinds of linking to companies in France and all over the world. So I was wondering kind of which of the non-Chinese kind of angles of the investigation you think more people should know about, and what kind of fallout you see happening in other kind of big centers around the world.
There's so much. And we both have some of our favorites. I mean, I think there's some really interesting investigations into Lebanese companies. China, Eric, especially as you know from living in Kinshasa, God, I think it is an incredibly diverse place when it comes to the business community, right? I mean, you have these huge communities of Belgians and Lebanese and Greeks and Americans and Chinese and Japanese and Koreans. And I mean, it's a really kind of, not to mention from all the countries of Africa too, neighboring or far away. And it's a fascinating place to report because of that. And, I think we found a lot of links to various Lebanese companies that have links to Hezbollah. We found, links to some Namibian companies, Pharaoh Islands. There's a really interesting piece that I could talk about. I'm sure Will has some other favorites, but one of my favorites is just for the first time a look at a Belgian businessman named Philippe Demerluz, who has had a close relationship to President Kabila for years, and he was the man who imported a lot of the heavy machinery, cars and tractors and things like that to Congo. And there was a 3-part series out of our Belgian partners into Philippe Demerluz that I think that people should look into. One of the things we're doing, I think, now is kind of filling in the last 15 years of history in Congo. There's some lacuna that we haven't really been able to look into because it's just been so difficult. And we're finally filling it in and seeing how business really happened and how politics really happened in Congo over the past 15 years. And I think that Congo Hold-Up has enabled us to do that for the Chinese in this case, or some of the other investigations that the other media partners did. But William probably has a few other favorites as well.
I'll just mention two. One was a story done by one of our partners in the Pharaoh Islands, which I didn't know any of this. That's why I found it interesting. How Pharaoh Island companies could be used to sort of muddy and conceal the ownership of vessels, and those vessels which were ultimately financed with public money from public money transited through BGFI and used to transport all sorts of things to Congo. But one of the things used to transport was sort of zebras and gazelles and giraffes to Joseph Kabila's private nature reserve. Some of the money was public money, some of it wasn't. Some of it actually came from CCC. So some of CCC's money, Dou's money, well, the money that Dou distributed went to one of these Pharaoh Island registered vessels. And the other one was sort of more basic, but it was work done by the Century, and just showed the ease with which the brother of Kabila, who ran BGFI Bank in Congo for 10 years, was able to buy real estate in the United States, in Washington in particular, how he didn't really have any problems to do that. And obviously that shows that this is not just about Congo, not just about a country that can be dismissed as sort of third world and corrupt. If corruption that happens in Congo, the money goes somewhere, and in this case it went quite easily to the United States. So it's a useful illustration of the international dimensions of this, and how things to resolve it need to be done outside Congo too.
It's the old story with the Congo that everybody's hands are dirty. It's just always the way it's been with that country. It's unbelievable. The Faroe Islands, just by the way, you're talking about those little tiny speck of an islands off the coast of Denmark that are best known for slaughtering dolphins, right?
Yeah,
that's the same Faroe Islands. Okay, good.
It's that Faroe. It's the Northern European Faroe Islands. Yeah, I think there's only one.
Boy, for such a small place, those guys are notorious.
Yeah,
they get into a lot of trouble for a tiny little speck of a place. And by the way, everybody, we've got the Century booked to come on the show in early January, so we'll dive deeper into the story in January. But for now, I recommend that everybody go check out the report on Bloomberg, China Cash Flowed Through Congo Bank to Former President's Cronies, written by William Clowes, Bloomberg's reporter in Nigeria, but formerly in Kinshasa, and Michael Kavanagh, Bloomberg's current reporter in the DRC. Both of you are on Twitter where can they find you on Twitter? William, what's the best way for people to connect with you on social media?
My DMs are open, and I think I'm at WTB Clowes. Very easy to find.
Okay. And then, Michael, where can they find you?
I'm at MJK Congo.
Okay, there it goes. Thank you both for taking the time to join us. A fascinating report. Congratulations on the investigation, and it was a pleasure to talk with you.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cobus. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, Cobus, so the only takeaway that you can have from this kind of conversation from people who are on the ground is that whenever there is a simple narrative about the Chinese in the Congo, don't believe it. Okay, because it's not true. Nothing conforms to simple narratives there. And this whole idea that the Chinese are not providing the infrastructure, again, as Michael pointed out, it's complicated. There's a governance side on the Congolese side that makes it difficult. There's a lack of transparency on both sides here. It's a hall of mirrors in Kinshasa. You really never know what you're looking at. And so when you go online and you see these kind of quick takes from all sorts of people, and you just, you got to resist that temptation because nothing is as it seems in the Congo. And again, I'm surprised that people like Michael and William tend to be optimistic about the future and what this portends for the future, and that's encouraging. To your point and to their point, the role of civil society in all of this is huge. And this isn't just Westerners. There is also a very important role that's being played by groups like AfriWatch and the EITI branch in Congo, in Kinshasa, the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative that's there. Very dynamic civil society that's playing a role here. So lots to be encouraged, but at the same time, I think with the Congo, you always have to step back and wait and take a breath and really think about it and speak to 4, 5, 6, 25, 30 people to really figure out what's going on.
Yeah, the Congo is really a handful. It's like really quite something. The thing is, that the Congo is so huge. Obviously, like many people always point out that the Congo is the size of Western Europe. And it really is physically and in lots of other ways at the heart of Africa. If the Congo works, Africa works. The fact that the Congo has been so dysfunctional means that that it seeps over into the rest of the continent. If, for example, the Congo has hydropower, capacity that could power most of the subcontinent. Its mineral riches. If the Congo were run well, then the entire continent would thrive. And the fact that it's run so badly and that it has been run so badly since colonial times is still dragging the whole continent down with it, and that it's just this ongoing, really kind of painful thing. It's just really like this kind of puzzle that sits at the heart of Africa.
I've always felt that nobody has a vested interest in the Congo succeeding. Because as you've pointed out, if the Congo was ever to fulfill even 50% of its potential, it would become a superpower. Given the wealth that it has, the landmass that it has, the geography, it has port access. I mean, it is a truly incredible country. Culturally, historically, geographically, and resource-wise. It has the means to be a superpower. But Rwanda has never found it in its interest. Uganda has never found in its interest. And the superpowers during the Cold War never found it in its interest for the Congo to be strong and stable. And it's just been cursed by history. And I have a very special place for the DRC. I've visited there many times. I lived there briefly. It is where the China-Africa project started. And even in the short time that I lived there, it has captivated me. And it's just really one of the most incredible places in the world. And you really hope that it's going to turn a corner with the Tshisekedi elections and Tshisekedi's government and in the next year. And again, so I really want to believe the optimism that Michael was talking about. But at the end of the day, I think one always has to be very cautious about the Congo. A couple other points here, while we're talking about the Congo. It's interesting because what he said about the fact that we never know which infrastructure projects are tied to the Sicomines deal and which ones are not, or to the China-Mali deal, or to any of these big mining deals. But there have been quite a few infrastructure announcements over the past few months. And I think we're going to see this pick up next year quite a bit. Again, maybe just for optics, maybe timing. I don't know why. Again, nothing is as it seems in the Congo. But we covered this week the fact that National Road 1, which is a massive road that goes, I think it was at least between 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers, all the way from Kinshasa down to Lubumbashi. The Chinese are starting to rehabilitate 96 kilometers of that, and they're going to keep doing on that. That's a really important road. And again, roads are so important in the Congo because A, there are so few of them, and B, because this is such a fractious country that is not really that unified, in part because there are not overland transport links between the east, the west and the south. And so building more roads and facilitating transportation is super important. The Chinese are also involved in building a new power station in Kinshasa. Lots of development happening in Kinshasa. And then there's a huge arts and cultural center that's coming into Clowes. Actually, no, that's coming into Kinshasa as well. And then there's a new training and vocational school that's opening up in Clowes, which is the heart of the cobalt zone there in the southeast. So many things happening on the infrastructure front that, again, we can't really tell. Is it because of these deals? Is it because of the optics? Is it because of things that are totally unrelated? Who knows? But a lot is happening in the Congo. And as I said at the beginning of the program, this is by far, in my opinion, the most consequential relationship that China has today in Africa, bar none. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yes, I think I would agree. I mean, in some ways, it still is in key ways a much narrower relationship than with, say, South Africa. Because I think in many ways South Africa also is a strong candidate for its most important relationship because it covers so much ground. It's across corporate and state and all of these different fields.
Like Djibouti, for example, trade, military, things
banking,
like that.
Kind of headquarters of companies in Johannesburg, all of those kind of things, and the fact that so much Chinese business runs through Johannesburg into the continent,
and trade as well through the port of Durban.
Yes. So in that sense, I might disagree because like it's like the DRC's niche is narrower but deeper.
That's right.
In the sense that it really is fundamental to Chinese kind of strategic kind of interests for the next 15 years at least.
That's right. So, related specifically to cobalt. So this is a very particular relationship. But as we've talked about, this may be short-lived because there is a growing impatience in the auto industry, especially in the US, Europe, Japan, and Korea, about being dependent on cobalt from the DRC that is largely controlled by Chinese interests, both in the mining and then in the processing. Also, what we reported this week is that 3 cobalt processing facilities and factories in Zhejiang province are offline now. Again, that just points to more problems in the supply chain and the reluctance and the apprehension that a lot of international automakers have to be reliant on China for cobalt. So maybe the move away from cobalt power EV batteries to lithium ion, sodium ion batteries may actually end the importance of Congo, at least for cobalt. Copper will still probably be very important. So yeah, such an interesting discussion. Boy, we've had really just a week of fascinating discussions, both with Andy Mock and now with the team from Bloomberg. But one of the big stories that we're going to be covering next year in depth is going to be the Congo. So if it's the most consequential or the second most consequential relationship for Africa, it is one of the most. Very, very important. And also just want to take note of Ambassador Zhu Jing. If you're not following him, I highly recommend it. He's an interesting guy. And it looks like he's gaining a very high profile in the Congo, given the prominence of these issues. And I get the sense that Ambassador Zhu is going to be a guy that we'll be hearing from again in Africa for a number of years. Remember that Chinese diplomats stay in their regions for quite some time. They don't circulate the way that U.S. and Europeans do, where they'll go from Africa to Asia to South America, back to Washington and so forth. That you look at the profiles of a lot of Chinese ambassadors, and they will have spent 8, 10, 12 years in different posts on the continent. And I do get the sense that Ambassador Zhu is a guy who's probably going to move maybe to South Africa or to Kenya or to Nigeria onto an even higher post. And he's got a Twitter feed, which is often very interesting. And he gets into these nasty little squabbles with people like Peter Pham, who's this, I don't know how you describe Peter Pham. He's an American, former Trump diplomat who's got his eye probably on becoming the Assistant Secretary of State under a next Trump administration. That's probably what he's won. He's at the Atlantic Council, but boy, he trolls Ambassador Zhu, and he's very anti-Chinese in Africa, and they, for some reason, fall for it. I don't understand, Cobus. When you see a guy like Peter Pham trolling you, don't respond. You know the old rule of don't feed the trolls. And that's a mantra that we live by. And I'm just like, every time I see Ambassador Zhu comment back to Peter Pham, I'm just like, dude, you're falling right into it.
Yeah. Just finally, also, I would, we've spoken so much about the problems of the Congo, but I would also encourage people to actually go to Spotify, wherever you stream music, and check out Congolese music, because throughout some of the worst conflicts in the world, some of the most heinous kind of human rights abuses, through some of the worst underdevelopment, Congo has somehow managed to build up this incredible kind of treasury of music. So really check it out. Congolese pop music is really amazing.
Let's leave on a positive note. It's a truly wonderful place. It has had its difficulties. It has been cursed, but let's hope that Michael's right and they're turning a corner and that this is really something new. And again, we'll continue to follow this in the new year. We've got another discussion coming up with the Century. And also, as we've alluded in some of our previous shows, we're going to be launching a new Arabic and French service next year. And our editor is from the Congo. So we're going to have a lot of great coverage of China-DRC relations in 2022. We're looking forward to having you join us, and we're going to be having newsletters in both French and Arabic for you to subscribe to as well. So if you are a Francophone and Arabophone, this is going to be really cool. So anyway, that'll do it for this edition of the show. Cobus and I will be back for one last episode this year for our year in review, year in preview show, sometime before the end of the year. Not quite sure when we're going to do it. We're going to take a little break next week, but we'll have that last show for you before the end of 2021. We'd like to thank you again for all of your support, both this year and over the years, and to all of our subscribers and to our Patreon members and to everybody who listens and are just our wonderful audience. Just again, a quick thank you. We're going to say it again next week in our last show of the year, but it's something that we feel from the bottom of our heart, and we just want to say that one more time. So until our last show of 2021, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. For more information about the China Africa Project, go to chinaafricaproject.com.